Most men spend their entire lives trying to earn something that was never available for purchase. Not wealth, not status, not the kind of presence that fills a room before you even open your mouth. Respect. The real kind. Not the polite variety people perform in meetings or at family dinners. The kind that exists around certain men quietly, without announcement, without effort, and is completely absent around others no matter how hard those others try. Here's what's strange about that. The men who have it rarely seem to be working for it. They're not louder. They're not more decorated on paper. They don't dominate every conversation or enter rooms expecting applause. If anything, they tend to be quieter than you'd expect, more selective, harder to read. And the men who don't have it, the ones constantly proving their worth, staying agreeable, keeping everyone comfortable, those men often work twice as hard and receive half the respect. That gap is not an accident. The difference between those two men isn't talent. It isn't luck. It isn't some personality trait you're either born with or permanently without. It's a set of psychological patterns. Patterns in how a man carries pressure, how he treats his own time, how he responds or doesn't when someone tries to push him somewhere he doesn't want to go. These patterns are learnable. But first, most men have to unlearn something. The habit of building their entire sense of worth around a single invisible question. What do people think of me? That question, asked often enough, quietly rewires everything. How you speak, what you agree to, whether you say what you actually think or what you've calculated will land well. It feels like social awareness. It feels like being thoughtful and considerate. It's a cage. This audiobook is about the psychology of men who've stepped out of it, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to move differently through the world. Enough that the world starts responding to them in ways they never had to ask for. None of what follows involves performance. No tactics, no scripts. Just a clearer understanding of the psychological patterns that quietly separate men who command respect from men who spend their whole lives chasing it. Let's begin where almost everything begins. With approval and the slow cost of making it the center of your life. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1, The Approval Machine. At some point, you stopped asking what you wanted and started asking what would go over well. It didn't happen on a specific day. There was no decision made, no moment where you consciously chose to reorganize your life around other people's reactions. It happened gradually, the way most costly habits form. One small adjustment at a time. One softened opinion. One swallowed disagreement. One yes that should have been a no. And slowly, without noticing it, approval became the operating system running underneath every decision you made. This is the approval machine. And the uncomfortable truth about it is that it doesn't look like weakness from the outside. It looks like someone who's easy to be around. Someone cooperative, low maintenance, reliably pleasant. People like that guy. They invite him places. They say nice things about him. They just don't particularly respect him. There's a specific psychological dynamic that happens when a man's behavior becomes organized around keeping others comfortable. People feel it, not consciously. Most people couldn't articulate what they're sensing, but somewhere in the brain's social processing, a signal gets registered. This person adjusts to the room. And once that signal appears, the dynamic shifts in ways that are subtle but significant. Requests become less careful. Opinions get tested more frequently. The man himself becomes easier to redirect, easier to pressure, easier to overlook. The approval machine runs on a simple fear. Not the dramatic kind, not fear of violence or failure or public humiliation. The quieter kind. Fear of disappointing someone. Fear of creating tension. Fear of being seen as difficult or cold or selfish. These fears are so normalized in most men that they no longer even register as fears. They just feel like consideration, like being a decent person. I spent a long time confusing the two. There was a period where I believed that making people comfortable was the same thing as earning their respect. So I agreed more than I should have. I made myself available when I had no business doing so. I walked into conversations already prepared to accommodate, already scanning for what the other person needed from me before I'd even heard what they wanted to say. People appreciated it. Nobody complained, and yet something always felt slightly miscalibrated. Like I was working very hard in a direction that wasn't quite producing what I expected. The realization came slowly. Respect and approval are not the same currency. They don't even trade in the same market. Approval is available to almost anyone willing to be agreeable enough. Smile at the right moments. Validate people's ideas. Stay out of conflict. The supply is essentially unlimited, which means its value, psychologically, is also limited. When something is easy to obtain, the brain doesn't assign it much weight. Respect operates differently. It's not given to the man who makes the room comfortable. It gravitates toward the man who seems comfortable regardless of whether the room approves. That's a completely different posture, and it communicates something the approval seeker never does. It communicates that his sense of himself doesn't depend on your reaction. Think about what that actually signals to the people around him. Here is a man whose opinion doesn't automatically bend in a headwind. Here is a man whose yes means something, because his no is also real. Here is a man who, when he tells you something, is probably telling you what he actually thinks, rather than what he's decided you want to hear. That man becomes someone whose words carry weight. Not because he demands it, because he's earned the signal. The approval machine, by contrast, slowly erodes that signal. Every time a man changes his position to reduce tension, the message transmitted, again, not consciously, but psychologically, is that his position was negotiable. And if his position is negotiable, then so is he. And if he's negotiable, people will keep negotiating. What makes this particularly difficult to escape is that the approval machine often gets rewarded in the short term. Agreeable men have fewer conflicts. People are friendlier toward them. The immediate environment feels smoother. But over months and years, something quietly accumulates on the other side of the ledger. The man himself begins to feel vaguely hollow. He's surrounded by people who like him, and somehow still feels unseen. He's helpful to everyone, and somehow still overlooked when it matters. He's done everything right, and somehow still doesn't feel respected. That hollowness is the approval machine's tax. It collects slowly, but it always collects. The exit from the machine doesn't require becoming someone difficult or cold or contrarian. It doesn't require picking fights or manufacturing conflict to prove you have a spine. It begins with something far simpler. It begins with the willingness to have a reaction that isn't immediately filtered through the question, how will this land? An opinion offered because it's what you actually think. A boundary held because it reflects your actual priorities. A no given without 4 sentences of apology cushioning it on all sides. These small acts feel almost insignificant in the moment, but they accumulate into something the approval machine never produces. A signal. Quiet, consistent, and unmistakable. This man knows who he is, and the world, it turns out, responds very differently to that man than it does to the one who's been optimizing for everyone else's comfort his entire life. Chapter 2. The calmer in the room. When things go wrong, watch who doesn't flinch. That person has either seen worse or doesn't care. Either way, you don't want to fight them. There's a specific kind of power that only becomes visible under pressure. It doesn't show up when everything is running smoothly. It doesn't appear in comfortable conversations or easy afternoons. It surfaces in the moments nobody planned for, when the deal falls apart, when someone raises their voice in a meeting, when a situation starts moving faster than anyone can manage, and the room instinctively looks around to figure out who's steady. In those moments, calmness is not a personality trait. It's a psychological signal. And it communicates something that no amount of confident posturing ever could. This situation does not own me. The human brain is wired to look for stability under uncertainty. It's not a conscious process. It happens automatically, the way eyes move toward light in a dark room. When tension enters a group, people instinctively scan for whoever appears most regulated, most grounded, most like they've seen this before and aren't particularly worried about it. And whoever that person is, whether they have a title or not, whether they're the oldest in the room or not, that person quietly absorbs authority. Not because they took it, because everyone else assigned it to them by instinct. This is why calm men are genuinely difficult to control. Emotional reactions are, in a very real sense, the primary tool people use to influence each other. Raise your voice and someone gets defensive. Express disappointment and someone scrambles to fix it. Project urgency and everyone starts moving faster, usually in the direction you've pointed them. These dynamics play out hundreds of times a day in offices, relationships, families, and negotiations. Most people don't deploy them intentionally. They're just responding to whatever emotional weather is in the room. But the effect is the same. Emotional states are contagious, and whoever controls the emotional temperature of a situation holds enormous informal power. The calm man breaks this circuit. When someone can't be provoked, the most common tools of social manipulation stop working. There's no emotional lever to pull, no visible anxiety to amplify, no defensiveness to exploit. The person attempting to influence through pressure finds themselves in a strange position. They've deployed their usual toolkit, and nothing happened. The man across from them simply waited, considered, and responded at a pace that made it clear the situation hadn't accelerated his heart rate. That experience is disorienting to people accustomed to getting reactions. And disorienting, in this context, means something specific. It means they recalibrate. They begin treating this person with more consideration, more care, more deliberateness. Not out of fear. Out of a quiet recognition that the normal social levers don't apply here. I learned this the wrong way first, which is probably the only way to really learn it. For a long time, I believed that reacting quickly signaled engagement. That if someone challenged something I'd said, and I didn't respond immediately, it might look like I had no response, like I'd been caught. So I defended in real time, interrupted when I felt interrupted, matched the energy in the room because it seemed like that's what the situation required. And it worked, in the sense that I was never mistaken for passive. But something else was also happening. I was handing the situation control of my behavior. Every time I reacted instantly, I was demonstrating that the external environment could reach inside and move me. And people noticed. Not consciously. But they kept testing it. The way people naturally test whatever seems unstable. The shift came gradually. I started noticing that the men who seemed most respected in high-friction situations were almost never the loudest. They were the stillest. They let things land before responding. They let silence exist without rushing to fill it. And their eventual responses carried something that fast reactions never do. The sense that words had been chosen rather than simply released. That distinction matters more than most people realize. A chosen response communicates something beyond its content. It communicates that the speaker is operating from a position of internal stability, that they had options and selected one deliberately, that the situation, whatever its pressure, did not override their capacity to think. This creates a specific psychological effect in observers. It registers as authority, not performed authority, the kind that announces itself loudly and requires constant maintenance, but the quieter kind that simply exists because it's demonstrated consistently over time. There is also something important happening internally when a man develops this habit. The pause between stimulus and response isn't just tactical. It creates a gap in which awareness becomes possible. Instead of being carried immediately into reaction, the mind gets a moment to observe what's actually happening. Not just the surface event, but the emotional impulse rising underneath it. That moment of observation is where real self-knowledge accumulates. Over time, a man learns his own triggers, learns which situations pull him toward defensiveness, which ones activate the need to prove something, which ones make him louder than he needs to be. And with that knowledge comes genuine choice. Emotions don't disappear in this process. That's an important distinction. The calm man isn't a man who doesn't feel things. He's a man who has created enough distance between what he feels and what he does about it. The frustration still arrives. The irritation still appears. But there's a moment now between the feeling and the behavior. A moment that belongs to him rather than to whatever just happened. That moment is where calm men live. And the world, sensing that gap, sensing that this person cannot simply be triggered into motion, begins to treat them differently. Conversations become more careful. Requests become more considered. The informal social contract of the room rewrites itself around the simple observable fact that this particular man does not come cheaply. He doesn't react to everything. Which means when he does react, people pay attention. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3. No is a complete sentence. The moment you add, "I'm so sorry," it's just that, to a no, you've turned a boundary into a suggestion. And suggestions, as anyone who's ever made one knows, are negotiable. This is the part most men miss. They understand, intellectually, that boundaries are important. They've heard the word enough times to know it's something they're supposed to have. But when the moment arrives, when someone makes a request, and the honest answer is no, something happens between the thought and the words. A small internal calculation runs. How do I say this without making it awkward? How do I decline without seeming unhelpful? How do I hold this boundary while simultaneously making sure the other person doesn't feel bad about it? And what comes out is not a no. It's an apology with a no buried somewhere inside it. The distinction is not trivial. Psychologically, the way a boundary is delivered determines whether it's received as a limit or as an opening position. When a man declines something and immediately wraps it in explanation, "I would, but I'm just really slammed this week, and I feel terrible saying no, and maybe next month things will be different." The message being transmitted underneath the words is not, "I've made a decision." The message is, "I'm uncomfortable with this decision, and I'm looking for your permission to feel okay about it." Which means the other person now has permission to negotiate, not maliciously. Most people aren't consciously exploiting over-explanation. but the brain receives signals before the conscious mind processes them. When someone senses that a refusal is accompanied by guilt and discomfort, it registers the same way a softened price does in a negotiation. The seller isn't sure about the number. There's room here. Let's see what happens if I push a little. So they push. Gently, usually. Are you sure? It would really only take an hour. Or they return later with the same request, slightly repackaged. Or they simply file away, without realizing it, that this person's no has a price. Enough persistence, enough social pressure, and the position tends to shift. A clean no works differently. Not aggressive, not cold, just clear. That doesn't work for me. Or simply, I won't be able to do that. No performance of guilt, no extended justification, no apology for having priorities, just a statement that reflects a decision that has already been made, internally, firmly, and without apparent need for external validation. That kind of no does something interesting to the people who receive it. It stops them, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way that clarity always stops people. There's nothing to negotiate with, no visible discomfort to work with, no suggestion that the decision is provisional. The conversation, in a sense, is over before it can become an argument. And that efficiency, that absence of drama, communicates something important about the man delivering it. He's done this before. He's comfortable here. His sense of himself does not depend on your approval of his decision. There was a specific evening, I remember, where this clicked in a way it hadn't before. A friend, someone I'd known for years, someone I genuinely liked, called with a request that would have cost me an entire Saturday. I'd already mentally committed to something else. The old pattern was fully prepared to activate. The apology was already forming. The explanation about how busy things had been was loading. And then I just didn't. I said I couldn't make it work. No elaboration. He paused for a moment, genuinely surprised, I think, and then said fine and moved on. The conversation ended in 30 seconds instead of 10 minutes, and nothing broke. No friendship ended. No coldness appeared the next time we spoke. He simply adjusted his plans, and that was the end of it. What strikes me now about that moment isn't the outcome. It's how much energy I had been spending, for years, on the version of that conversation that required me to perform discomfort, to make my own decisions feel acceptable. There's a broader psychological principle underneath all of this that goes beyond the mechanics of saying no. Every time a man declines something without apologizing for it, he's quietly building something. Not just a reputation for having limits, though that happens too. He's building an internal architecture, a structure made of decisions that reflect actual values rather than managed perceptions. Over time, that structure creates a different experience of life. Things stop feeling reactive. There's less of the low-grade exhaustion that comes from constantly monitoring everyone else's expectations and calibrating behavior accordingly. The man begins to feel, perhaps for the first time in a long time, like the primary author of his own schedule, his own attention, his own time. That feeling is not arrogance. It's ownership. And ownership changes a man's presence in ways that are visible, even when nothing on the surface appears different. He walks into rooms without the slight forward lean of someone preparing to accommodate. He listens to requests without the instant calculation of how to decline them gracefully. He moves through his day with the particular ease of someone who knows that his time is his. Not because he's declared it dramatically, but because he's demonstrated it consistently, one unadorned no at a time. There's also something important about what a clean no protects beyond time and energy. It protects honesty. When a man says yes to things he doesn't mean, and no to things wrapped in so much apology they barely register as refusals, The people around him slowly lose access to his actual opinions. They interact with a managed version of him, curated, softened, optimized for minimal friction. And eventually, that managed version becomes the only one anyone knows. The real man, the one with actual preferences and genuine limits, becomes a stranger even to people who see him every day. A clean no, simple, steady, requiring no performance, is one of the small ways a man stays legible to the world, stays real, stays himself. And the world, it turns out, trusts that man considerably more than the one who always finds a way to say yes. Chapter 4. The Always Available Trap. You were trying to be reliable. What you became was predictable. There's a difference, and it cost you. Reliability is valuable. It means people can count on you when it matters. It means your word carries weight. Your commitments are real. Your presence means something. Reliability is one of the quieter forms of respect a man can build over time. Predictability is something else entirely. Predictability means people have already accounted for you. They know you'll respond immediately. They know you'll adjust your schedule. They know that whatever they need, whenever they need it, the answer will probably be yes. Your behavior has become so consistent and so automatic that it no longer requires their consideration. You've become a given, and givens, psychologically, are not particularly valued. This is the always available trap, and it's particularly difficult to recognize because it's built entirely from what looks like virtue. The man who falls into it is usually genuinely generous. He responds quickly because he cares. He adjusts his schedule because he wants to be helpful. He makes himself accessible because he values the people around him and wants them to feel that. None of these impulses are wrong. The problem isn't the generosity. The problem is the absence of any visible limit on it. Because when generosity has no edges, it stops feeling like generosity. It starts feeling like a feature of the environment, something that's simply there, like air, present, useful, and almost entirely taken for granted. The human brain assigns value through scarcity. This is not a cynical observation about human nature. It's a deeply embedded psychological mechanism that operates constantly and largely unconsciously. Things that are rare feel important. Things that are always available feel ordinary. Time that is difficult to access feels meaningful. Time that adjusts to fit everyone else's needs feels, over time, like something that doesn't quite belong to anyone, including the man giving it away. I watched this happen to someone I worked with for several years. Exceptionally capable, genuinely kind, the kind of person who answered messages within minutes regardless of the hour. People loved working with him. He was always praised in meetings. And yet, when decisions were being made, real ones, about direction and resources and whose judgment carried weight, he was rarely the one people turned to. They turned to someone quieter, someone whose time was harder to get, someone who, when he showed up to a conversation, seemed to be there by choice rather than by reflex. The always available man had accidentally communicated something he never intended to communicate. He had suggested, through the sheer consistency of his accessibility, that he didn't have anything more important going on, that his attention was ambient, always present, never scarce, therefore never particularly precious. It wasn't true. But presence is interpreted, not just observed. And what his presence said, quietly and persistently, was, "I am here whenever you need me," which sounds generous, which is generous. But it also, over time, says something else. "I have no competing priorities that outrank your request." And that second message, received often enough, quietly reclassifies a man in the social imagination. From someone whose time is valuable to someone whose time is simply available. The correction doesn't require becoming cold or deliberately withholding. It doesn't require manufacturing artificial delays or pretending to be busier than you are. It requires something simpler and more honest than that. It requires actually having priorities that come first, and then letting that reality be visible. A man who is working on something that matters to him doesn't answer every message within 90 seconds. Not because he's performing unavailability, but because he's genuinely elsewhere. His attention is actually occupied. His time is actually committed to something. And when he does respond, when he does make time, the act carries a different weight, because it's clearly a choice rather than a reflex. This extends into personal relationships in ways that are worth examining carefully. There is a particular dynamic that develops when one person in a relationship becomes the constant emotional provider. Always available for the late-night conversation, always ready to absorb the stress, process the anxiety, hold the worry that belongs to someone else. At first, this feels meaningful. Being the person someone turns to feels like closeness, but over time, an imbalance settles in. The provider's own needs get quietly deprioritized, first by the other person, and eventually by the provider himself, who has so thoroughly organized his availability around others that he's lost track of what he actually needs. The relationship that once felt like connection starts to feel like a role. And roles, unlike relationships, don't nourish. High-value men tend to move differently in this territory. Not because they lack empathy or pull back from people they care about, but because they understand something fundamental about sustainability. Energy given without replenishment eventually runs out. Attention scattered across every incoming request eventually becomes attention that serves nothing well. The most genuinely useful version of themselves requires protection. Protection of time, of focus, of the internal resources that make real presence possible. Selective availability isn't selfishness, it's maintenance. There's another dimension to this worth naming. When a man is always available, he inadvertently communicates something about how he sees himself relative to the people around him. He positions himself, through his behavior, as the one who fits into other people's timelines, rather than the one who has a timeline worth fitting into. And people, reading that signal, adjust accordingly. They begin to assume his schedule is flexible because he's always demonstrated that it is. They begin to make plans without factoring him in because he'll rearrange anyway. They begin, almost without realizing it, to treat his time as a communal resource rather than a personal one. The man who reverses this doesn't do it through announcement. He doesn't declare that he's changing, or explain that he's been too available, or ask to be treated differently. He simply starts behaving differently. Responses come when he has attention to give, rather than the moment a notification arrives. Requests are considered rather than automatically accepted. Commitments are made intentionally rather than by default, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the people around him begin to recalibrate. They start scheduling instead of assuming. They start asking instead of expecting. They start treating his time with the same consideration he's now visibly treating it with himself. Not because he demanded respect, because he demonstrated it to himself first, and the rest followed. Chapter 5. Confidence without an audience. Some men enter a room and immediately start performing. Others walk in and wait to see if the room is worth their time. The difference between those two men is not confidence. It's the source of confidence. And that source, where a man's sense of his own value actually comes from, determines almost everything about how he moves through the world. Most people are familiar with the loud version of confidence. It fills space. It volunteers opinions quickly. It has a story ready for every occasion and a credential available for every skeptic. It laughs a little too readily at its own observations and scans the room between sentences, checking whether people are tracking. This version of confidence is familiar because it's common. And it's common because it works. In the short term, in certain environments, with certain audiences. But it has a structural problem. It requires an audience to function. Take away the room, remove the people, eliminate the external feedback loop, and it has nothing to feed on. Which means it's not really confidence at all. It's approval-seeking wearing confidence as a costume. And most people, somewhere underneath their conscious processing, can feel the difference. Quiet confidence doesn't need the room. It doesn't require anyone to be watching. It doesn't shift register depending on who just walked in. It doesn't get louder when challenged or deflate when ignored. It exists as a constant rather than a performance. Not because the man carrying it is trying to project stability, but because his sense of himself is genuinely not contingent on what the room decides about him in any given moment. This is rarer than it sounds. The drive for external validation runs deep in most men. Research in social psychology has found that men tend to derive self-worth more heavily from recognition, status, and achievement than almost any other source. Which means the default wiring pushes toward the audience, toward checking whether the performance is landing, whether the room is approving, whether the value being projected is being received. Stepping off that circuit requires something deliberate, something built internally over time, through a series of choices that gradually relocate the source of confidence from outside to inside. The man who has made that relocation behaves differently in ways that are specific and observable. He doesn't fill silence. In conversations where many people feel the pull to speak, to demonstrate engagement, to signal intelligence, to avoid the social awkwardness of a pause, he simply waits. He listens to what's actually being said rather than preparing his response while the other person is still talking. And when he does speak, it's because he has something to contribute, not because the silence made him uncomfortable. This is a small behavior with an outsized effect. Words offered selectively carry more weight than words offered constantly. The mind instinctively values what appears less frequently. He doesn't defend automatically. When someone challenges his opinion, the insecure response is immediate counter-pressure. Raise the energy, repeat the position more firmly, find a way to win the exchange before it costs too much social ground. The man who doesn't need validation does something different. He considers the challenge. Actually considers it, not as a threat to be neutralized, but as information to be evaluated. If it has merit, he adjusts. If it doesn't, he says so calmly and moves on. Either way, his emotional temperature doesn't change. The disagreement doesn't destabilize him, because his value was never riding on being right in the first place. He receives praise without becoming attached to it. This one is subtle but revealing. When someone who depends heavily on validation gets a compliment, something lights up, and then something tightens. Because now there's a standard to maintain, an image to protect, a new baseline of expectations to manage. Praise becomes pressure. The man who doesn't need validation receives a compliment differently. He acknowledges it genuinely, appreciates the recognition, and then returns to himself. The compliment doesn't reorganize his sense of who he is. It lands and passes, the way weather passes. Pleasant while it's there, not structurally significant when it's gone. There's a woman I knew briefly who described, without realizing what she was describing, the effect this kind of presence has on people around it. She was talking about someone she worked with. Not a friend, not someone she particularly knew well, just a colleague she'd observed in meetings over the course of a year. She said something that stayed with me. She said, "I have no idea what he thinks of me." and somehow that makes me want to figure it out." She didn't mean it romantically. She meant it as a social observation. This person's approval was not automatic. His attention was not ambient. His opinion of the people around him was not constantly visible and available for reassurance. And that absence created something. A low hum of curiosity, of wanting to earn something that wasn't being handed out freely. That dynamic is not manufactured. It cannot be faked, at least not sustainably. It emerges naturally from a man who genuinely doesn't need the room to validate him, and therefore the room finds itself wanting to. The internal work that produces this is less dramatic than people expect. It doesn't require a revelation or a transformation. It accumulates through small, repeated decisions. Choosing not to explain yourself when explanation isn't necessary. Choosing not to defend a position just because someone raised an eyebrow. Choosing to sit with discomfort, the discomfort of silence, of uncertainty, of not knowing exactly what people think, without rushing to resolve it through performance. Each of those choices, made consistently over time, builds something. Not a persona, not a strategy, a foundation. A stable internal structure that doesn't require constant external reinforcement to remain standing. And once that foundation exists, once a man's sense of himself is genuinely rooted in something he carries rather than something the room provides, his entire presence shifts. He becomes, in the most precise sense of the word, harder to move, not harder to connect with, not colder or more distant, just harder to destabilize, harder to flatter into poor decisions, harder to pressure into positions he doesn't hold, harder to manipulate through the social levers that work so reliably on men whose confidence still depends on the audience. And the room, sensing all of this without being able to fully articulate it, responds with something it rarely offers to the performer: genuine respect. Chapter 6. The 2-second advantage. Your mouth already knew what it wanted to say. The problem is, your mouth is terrible at strategy. There is a very small window of time that separates a reaction from a response. 2 seconds, sometimes less. In the moment, it feels like nothing, barely enough time to register that something has happened, let alone decide how to handle it. But those 2 seconds contain something that most men spend their entire lives never fully accessing. A choice. Not the automatic output of whatever emotional state just got activated. Not the reflexive defense, the instant counter, the immediate correction. An actual choice, made by the part of the brain that can see the whole situation rather than just the part that feels threatening right now. That gap, small as it is where emotional intelligence lives. And the men who have learned to inhabit it consistently are, in practical terms, operating with an advantage that compounds over every interaction, every negotiation, every difficult conversation they will ever have. The mechanics of why this works are worth understanding. When something happens that feels like a threat, a criticism, a challenge, a disrespectful comment, an unexpected problem, the brain's threat detection system activates before the conscious mind has fully processed what's occurring. This is not a flaw. It's millions of years of engineering designed to keep humans alive in environments where hesitation had real costs. The problem is that the same system that was built to respond to physical danger also responds to someone questioning your idea in a meeting. The emotional chemistry is similar. The urgency feels similar, but the situation is not similar. And reacting to a professional disagreement with the same speed and intensity appropriate for a physical threat is, to put it plainly, a significant miscalibration. The pause interrupts that miscalibration. It doesn't prevent the emotional response. The frustration still arrives. The defensiveness still rises. The impulse to respond is still fully present, but it inserts a moment between the impulse and the action. And in that moment, something different becomes possible. The mind can ask a question it cannot ask when it's already moving. What does this situation actually require from me? Sometimes the answer is a firm response. Sometimes it's a question. Sometimes it's almost nothing. A calm acknowledgement that doesn't escalate, doesn't concede, doesn't make the moment bigger than it needs to be. But none of those calibrated responses are available to the man who has already started talking before he finished thinking. I remember a specific meeting, early in my career, higher stakes than I was ready for, where someone challenged something I'd presented in a way that felt, in the moment, like a personal attack. It probably wasn't. Looking back, it almost certainly wasn't. But the emotional red was immediate and confident, and so was my response. I pushed back hard and fast, with more energy than the situation warranted, and the conversation shifted from being about the idea to being about the tension between us. Nothing productive happened after that. The meeting ended with everyone slightly more guarded than when it began, and I spent the drive home replaying the moment where I could have simply paused, could have let the challenge land, taken a breath, responded to what was actually said rather than what I'd felt it meant. The 2-second advantage doesn't just change outcomes. It changes how people experience you. When someone reacts instantly to every stimulus, they become, in a very specific sense, readable. The people around them learn quickly which buttons exist and roughly what happens when you press them. This knowledge, even when it's never consciously deployed, fundamentally alters the dynamic. It means that in any tense situation, the reactive man is partially being managed by people who understand his triggers better than he does. His emotional responses have become predictable enough to be anticipated, accounted for, and sometimes deliberately activated. The man who pauses removes this leverage entirely. His responses are not automatic, which means they cannot be reliably predicted. He might respond vigorously. He might respond gently. He might not respond in any significant way at all. This unpredictability, rooted not in volatility, but in genuine deliberateness, makes him considerably harder to manipulate. There is no reliable button to press, no guaranteed reaction to engineer. The person across from him must actually deal with him, rather than with a set of known reflexes. There's a secondary effect of the pause that operates internally rather than socially. When a man consistently creates space between stimulus and response, he starts to develop something that reactive patterns never allow: genuine self-knowledge. He begins to notice what actually triggers him, and more importantly, why. The anger that flares when someone interrupts him, is it actually about the interruption, or about something older and deeper that interruption happens to activate? The defensiveness that rises when his work is criticized, is it about the specific criticism, or about a more general anxiety about his competence that has nothing to do with this particular moment? These questions don't get asked when the response is already in motion. They only become available in the pause. And the answers, accumulated over time, produce a man who is considerably more honest with himself than he was before. Who knows his edges? Who can feel a trigger activating and recognize it as a trigger rather than as an accurate read of the situation? Who can choose, with that recognition, whether to act on it or let it pass? This is what emotional maturity actually looks like in practice. Not the absence of strong feelings, not a performed serenity that pretends difficult things aren't difficult. Just the consistent, quiet ability to be aware of what's happening inside while still choosing what happens outside. The effect on other people is cumulative and significant. Over months and years of consistent pausing, of responding thoughtfully where others react instantly, of staying level where others escalate, of choosing words rather than simply releasing them. A reputation builds. Not the loud kind of reputation, not the kind announced or campaigned for. The kind that exists in how people describe you when you're not in the room. He's steady. He doesn't get rattled. You always know where you stand with him, because he doesn't blow up and say things he doesn't mean. That reputation is a form of social capital that accumulates quietly and pays out in ways that are difficult to trace back to their source. People bring harder problems to steady men. They trust steadier men with more sensitive information. They give steadier men more room to be wrong occasionally, because the baseline is so clearly reliable. All of it traceable ultimately to a 2-second gap. A gap that most men blow past without ever realizing it existed. Chapter 7: The Man with Somewhere to Go. People give unsolicited advice to men who look lost. They leave alone the ones who clearly know where they're going. This is not a metaphor. Watch it happen in any social environment, and the pattern is consistent. The man whose direction is unclear becomes, almost automatically, a project. People sense the vacancy and move to fill it. They offer suggestions. They propose redirections. They volunteer opinions about what he should be doing, who he should be talking to, which path makes more sense given his situation. They mean well mostly. But underneath the helpfulness is a simple psychological read. This person hasn't decided yet, which means there's still room for my input. The man with clear direction receives a completely different response. Not because he's announced his plans or explained his goals or asked people to respect his path. Simply because the signal his presence transmits doesn't contain an opening. He's already oriented. The question of what he should be doing has already been answered. By him, for himself, in a way that's visibly settled. And people reading that signal step back. Not out of indifference, out of recognition. The seat is taken. Direction changes a man's presence at a level that precedes conversation. It lives in how he moves. In the particular quality of his attention, focused rather than scattered, engaged rather than searching. In the way he evaluates what's in front of him against something internal and already established. A man with direction doesn't encounter an opportunity and ask, "Is this good?" He asks, "Does this belong on my path?" That second question is a completely different cognitive operation, and it produces a completely different kind of man. Most men spend significant portions of their lives in the first mode, not because they're lazy or directionless by nature, but because direction is genuinely difficult to find and even harder to maintain. Life is loud. Opinions are plentiful. The gap between where someone is and where they want to be is often uncomfortable enough that it's easier to stay busy, to fill the days with motion and responsiveness, than to sit with the discomfort of figuring out what the motion should actually be building toward. Busyness and direction are not the same thing. This is one of the more useful distinctions a man can make about his own life. A man can be extraordinarily busy, responding to messages, attending meetings, helping everyone around him, never having an idle moment, and still have no particular direction. He's moving constantly and going nowhere specific. The motion feels productive. The calendar looks full. But at the end of the year, the end of 5 years, the shape of the life being built is not obviously different from what it would have been without any of that effort. Direction requires a different question. Not what do I need to do today, but what am I actually building? And not in the abstract motivational poster sense. Concretely, what specific thing, if I work on it consistently over the next several years, will produce a life that reflects something I actually chose, rather than something that simply accumulated? That question is uncomfortable because it requires honesty. It requires admitting that not everything currently occupying your time deserves to be there. It requires acknowledging that some relationships, some commitments, some habits are not on the path. They're just familiar, and familiarity has a gravitational pull that direction has to be strong enough to resist. When a man finds his direction, even approximately, even imperfectly, something reorganizes. Decisions that were previously complicated become simpler, not because the options change, but because the filter changes. He's no longer evaluating choices in isolation, asking which one seems better in the abstract. He's evaluating them against a direction, asking which one moves him forward and which one moves him sideways. That filter eliminates enormous amounts of noise. The social invitations that were vaguely obligatory, the projects that were interesting but tangential, the conversations that consumed hours without producing anything that mattered to him. They don't all disappear, but they get evaluated differently, and the ones that don't survive evaluation get declined with a clarity that feels almost effortless, because the no isn't coming from preference or mood. It's coming from direction. That doesn't belong on my path. 5 words that require no further justification. This clarity has a visible effect on others that's worth understanding. When a man clearly knows where he's going, the people around him stop trying to navigate for him. They stop offering unsolicited redirections. They start asking questions instead of giving answers. What are you working on? Where is this heading? How is it going? The conversational posture shifts from advice-giving to curiosity, and that shift is a form of respect. The specific respect that one person offers another when they recognize that the second person's path is already being managed competently. Direction also solves, partially and practically, the problem of confidence. Most men look for confidence before they find direction, which is the wrong sequence. Confidence that precedes direction is mostly performance. It has nothing solid underneath it, which is why it requires so much maintenance and collapses so easily under real pressure. Confidence that follows direction is different. It's earned rather than projected. It comes from the accumulated evidence of having made decisions, followed through on them, and watched the path become incrementally clearer as a result. That confidence doesn't need to announce itself because it isn't trying to convince anyone of anything. It's simply the natural byproduct of the man who knows what he's doing and has been doing it long enough to trust the process. There's a specific kind of freedom that direction produces that doesn't get talked about enough. Freedom from the low-grade anxiety of living reactively. When a man has no clear direction, every incoming opportunity carries a kind of weight. Maybe this is the thing. Maybe I should be doing this. Maybe I'm missing something by not pursuing this. The options multiply and none of them close because there's no internal standard against which to evaluate them. Everything remains theoretically possible, and nothing actually gets chosen. Direction closes that loop. It makes the world smaller in a way that feels, counterintuitively, like expansion. Not smaller because opportunities disappear, but smaller because fewer of them require serious consideration. The filter is clear, the path is visible, and the energy that was previously scattered across every incoming possibility becomes available for the thing actually being built. That concentrated energy is visible to people. They sense a man who is not available for every distraction, not interested in every tangent, not looking for someone to tell him what to do next. They sense a man who already knows. And the presence that produces, focused, settled, quietly purposeful, is one of the most attractive things a human being can project. Not attractive in the superficial sense. Attractive in the deeper sense. The sense that makes people want to be around someone. That makes them trust someone with important things. That makes them, almost without realizing it, Start to organize around that person's direction, rather than trying to redirect it. The man with somewhere to go becomes, over time, the man others want to follow. Not because he asked them to, because his direction made it obvious where the momentum was. Chapter 8. Your word is your architecture. Nobody announces the moment they stopped believing you. It happens quietly, one small broken promise at a time. Not the dramatic ones, not the lies that get confronted in difficult conversations or the betrayals that end relationships in a single evening. Those are obvious enough that people can point to them, process them, decide what they mean. The damage that's harder to recover from is the slower kind. The commitment that got forgotten. The plan that got quietly dropped without acknowledgement. The statement made with full apparent sincerity that simply never translated into action. Each one small enough to excuse. Each one accumulated into something that eventually becomes a conclusion. This person's words don't quite mean what they seem to mean. Once that conclusion exists, even as a vague feeling rather than a conscious thought, it changes everything. Not dramatically. The relationship doesn't end. The professional dynamic doesn't collapse. People continue to be pleasant, to cooperate, to exchange the normal social currency of daily life. But something shifts underneath. A small recalibration happens. This person's commitments are now mentally filed differently. Their assurances are heard with a background discount. Their enthusiasm is noted but not banked on. They've become, without anyone formally deciding it, a person whose word has a reliability rating, and the rating isn't high. This process is invisible to most men because the individual incidents feel so minor. One missed follow-up, one plan changed without much notice, one time saying I'll look into that and then not looking into it. None of these feel like integrity failures in the moment. They feel like life, busy, complicated, full of competing demands. The intention was real. The circumstances just intervened. Surely anyone reasonable can understand that. And people do understand it. They're just also updating their model of you every time it happens. This is what most men don't fully account for. That trust is not built in grand gestures and destroyed only by dramatic betrayals. It's built and destroyed in the smallest units of everyday behavior. The follow-through on the inconvenient commitment. The honest answer when a comfortable one was available. The acknowledgement of a dropped ball rather than the quiet hope that no one noticed. These micro moments are the actual material of which a man's word is made. And over time, the accumulated pattern of those moments becomes something other people feel before they can articulate it. A sense of whether this person's words and actions inhabit the same world. When they do, something powerful becomes available. Trust. Not the polite social kind that people extend automatically to anyone who hasn't given them specific reason not to. The deeper kind. The kind that makes someone willing to be genuinely vulnerable around you. To give you access to things that matter. To rely on your judgment in situations where being wrong would actually cost them something. That trust cannot be requested. It cannot be accelerated through charm or credentials or demonstrated intelligence. It accrues only one way. Through the repeated observable alignment of what a man says and what a man does. The architecture metaphor is precise for a reason. Architecture is structural. It exists not as decoration, but as the thing that makes everything else possible. A building with a compromised foundation can look completely normal from the outside for a surprisingly long time. The windows are clean. The walls are straight. Nothing about the visible surface suggests a problem. But the foundation determines what the structure can support, what pressures it can withstand, what it looks like after years of weight and weather. A man's word works the same way. It is the foundation on which every relationship, every collaboration, Every form of influence he hopes to have is actually built. And like a foundation, its condition is mostly invisible until something heavy rests on it. I made a specific mistake for several years that I now recognize clearly. I was generous with commitments and careless with follow-through. Not dishonestly, I meant everything I said when I said it, but meaning something in the moment and ensuring it actually happens are different disciplines, and I had developed only one of them. The result, over time, was a quiet gap between my stated intentions and my actual reliability that I wasn't aware of because nobody told me directly. People rarely do. They just quietly update their model and adjust their behavior accordingly. I noticed it only in retrospect, in the specific texture of certain relationships, a guardedness I couldn't quite account for, a reluctance to rely on me for things that mattered, a subtle distance that hadn't always been there. The repair required nothing complicated, just the slow, unspectacular work of saying less and delivering more. Making commitments carefully rather than generously. Acknowledging dropped balls directly rather than hoping they'd been forgotten. Doing the thing I'd said I would do even when circumstances had shifted enough that not doing it would have been easily justified. None of this is heroic. That's exactly the point. The architecture of a man's word is built not from heroic acts, but from the steady, unremarkable accumulation of small reliabilities. The call made when promised. The task completed when committed to. The opinion given honestly when a comfortable deflection was available. Brick by brick, each one individually insignificant, together forming something that either holds weight or doesn't. There's an additional dimension here beyond the relational. A man who keeps his word to others is also keeping his word to himself. And that internal consistency, the alignment between what he says he values and how he actually spends his time, between who he says he is and what he actually does, is the foundation of self-respect in its most literal form. Research in psychology has found, specifically, that self-respect is not built primarily through achievement or external recognition. It's built through the repeated experience of acting in alignment with one's own stated values, of doing what you said you would do, even when only you know whether you did it. This is why integrity is not simply a social virtue, it's a psychological one. The man who keeps commitments even when no one is watching builds, through that private consistency, a relationship with himself that becomes the bedrock of everything else. He trusts his own word. He believes his own intentions. He doesn't carry the low-grade self-doubt that accumulates in men who have learned, through repeated experience, that their stated intentions are somewhat negotiable. That internal solidity shows up externally in ways that are difficult to fake. People sense it in how a man carries himself, in the particular quality of his certainty, not arrogance but groundedness, in the way his statements land as statements rather than as performances, in the simple, quiet authority of a man whose words and life are recognizably the same thing. Your word is your architecture. Build it carefully, because everything you want to build on top of it depends entirely on whether it holds. Chapter 9. The man who doesn't need to win. There's a certain kind of man who walks out of an argument having said almost nothing, and somehow everyone in the room sides with him. This is confusing the first time you witness it. The rules of social competition, as most men have absorbed them, suggest that influence flows to whoever makes the strongest case, whoever has the best argument, whoever defends their position most effectively and dismantles the opposing one most completely. The debate goes to the most persuasive combatant. The room follows the strongest voice, except that's not what actually happens. Not consistently, not in the rooms that matter. What actually happens, observed carefully over time, is that the room follows the person who seems least invested in the room following them. The person whose sense of themselves is visibly not riding on the outcome of this particular disagreement. The person who can hold a position without gripping it, who can engage with opposition without treating it as a threat, who can lose an argument without losing themselves, who seems, throughout the entire exchange, to be participating in a conversation rather than fighting a battle. That person is operating from a completely different psychological position than the man who needs to win. And the difference is felt by everyone present, even when nobody could articulate exactly what they're sensing. The need to win every disagreement is, at its core, a form of approval-seeking wearing a more aggressive costume. It looks like confidence. It presents itself as confidence, announces itself as confidence, often genuinely believes itself to be confidence. But underneath the assertion and the counter-argument and the determination to not let this point go until the other person concedes it, there is a fundamental anxiety. If I don't win this, something is lost. My credibility, my standing, my claim to being the kind of man whose judgment matters. The argument isn't really about the topic. It's about identity protection. And identity protection is a defensive operation, which means the man running it is, in the most precise sense, on the back foot. The man who doesn't need to win isn't running that operation. His identity isn't on the table in this disagreement. He has opinions, often strong ones, often ones he'll defend persistently when they're genuinely important. But his opinions and his sense of himself are kept in separate accounts. Challenging the opinion doesn't threaten the account, which means he can engage with challenges directly, without the defensive energy that signals to everyone watching that something vulnerable is being protected. This produces a specific and somewhat paradoxical social dynamic. The man who argues less forcefully is often perceived as more credible. The man who concedes points readily is often trusted more. The man who can say that's a fair point, I hadn't considered that, without apparent cost to his composure, earns a form of respect that the relentless debater never quite achieves. Because he's demonstrated, through the act of genuine concession, that his engagement with the conversation is intellectual rather than territorial. He's actually thinking rather than just defending. I spent a period of my life that I'm not particularly proud of being very good at arguments. Sharp, quick, difficult to corner. I could find the weakness in almost any position and apply pressure to it efficiently. I won a lot of disagreements. I eventually noticed, stopped being invited into certain conversations. Not formally, nobody said anything. But the people whose input I actually valued started having discussions without me, or having them before I arrived, or wrapping them up quickly when I appeared. And it took longer than it should have to understand why. Winning had made me expensive to disagree with, which meant people stopped disagreeing with me, which meant I stopped getting honest feedback, which meant I was operating in a progressively smaller and more insulated version of reality, surrounded by either people who'd learned to agree with me or people who'd learned to keep their disagreements somewhere else. Neither of these is a situation a man should want. Both of them are the direct result of treating every disagreement as a contest that must be won. The correction required something that felt, initially, like loss. Choosing not to press an advantage when I had one. Allowing a point to stand that I could have dismantled. Asking a genuine question rather than making a point disguised as one. Each of these felt like conceding ground. What they were actually doing was something different. They were signaling to the people around me that the conversation mattered more than the outcome. That understanding something correctly was more important than being seen as someone who understood it first. That signal, received consistently over time, rebuilt something that years of winning had quietly eroded. There's a deeper psychological principle here that extends beyond arguments into the full texture of how a man navigates social environments. The need to win in conversations, in competitions, in the informal status negotiations that happen constantly in any group is fundamentally a scarcity mindset applied to self-worth. It operates on the premise that respect and credibility are finite resources, that someone else's gain is my loss, that every interaction is a zero-sum exchange in which one person comes out ahead and one person doesn't. Men who carry this mindset are exhausting to be around, even when they're not overtly combative. There's a low-grade competitive energy in everything they do, in how they tell stories, in how they respond to other people's achievements, in how they handle being wrong about something relatively minor. The scoreboard is always running, and because the scoreboard is always running, every interaction carries a faint charge of anxiety. Something is always slightly at stake. The man who has genuinely stopped needing to win moves differently, not passively. He's not someone who has simply given up on having opinions or stopped caring about outcomes. He cares about the right things. He cares about the quality of the work, the honesty of the conversation, the actual resolution of the actual problem. He just doesn't particularly care about whether his contribution to that resolution was acknowledged as the decisive one. This distinction, caring about the outcome without needing to own the credit for it, is one of the cleaner markers of genuine psychological maturity. And it produces, over time, exactly the opposite of what the win-at-all-costs approach produces. Instead of a man people work around, it produces a man people want to work with. Instead of a man whose involvement raises the stakes, it produces a man whose involvement lowers the temperature. Instead of a man who makes every room slightly more tense, it produces a man who makes every room slightly more honest. The argument he walks out of having said almost nothing is not a loss. It's a demonstration, a quiet, consistent demonstration of the thing that loud winning never quite manages to prove, that his value doesn't depend on the verdict. Chapter 10. Standards as Identity. You don't need to announce your standards. You just have to hold them long enough for people to notice, and they will notice. That's the part most men underestimate. The assumption is that standards require declaration, that to be taken seriously, a man must explain what he expects, articulate what he won't accept, make clear in advance where his lines are. But standards that require constant announcement are not really standards. They're wishes. Real standards don't need to be explained. They demonstrate themselves through behavior, consistently, over time, until the people around a man have simply absorbed them as a known feature of the landscape. That's just how he is. When a group of people arrive at that conclusion about a man, when his standards have been present long enough and held firmly enough that they've become part of how others understand him, something important has happened. His standards have become his identity. And identity, in social environments, operates completely differently from stated preference. Stated preferences can be tested, negotiated, worn down through persistence or pressure, or the simple accumulation of small exceptions. Identity cannot. You don't negotiate with someone's identity. You adjust to it. This is the destination. But the path there requires understanding something that most men get backwards. Standards are not primarily about other people. They're not a set of requirements you impose on the world to protect yourself from being mistreated. They're a set of requirements you hold yourself to, first and most rigorously, that then shape what you're willing to accept from the environment around you. The man who has high standards for his own behavior, for his honesty, his follow-through, his treatment of people, the quality of his work, naturally develops a corresponding clarity about what he's willing to accept from others. not as a rule he's decided to enforce, but as a simple consequence of his own self-respect. A man who takes his own commitments seriously finds it difficult to operate comfortably around people who don't take theirs seriously. Not as a moral judgment, just as a practical incompatibility. This sequence matters enormously. Standards that flow outward from internal self-respect are stable. They don't require maintenance or enforcement, or the constant vigilance of someone protecting a position. They exist because the man himself lives by them, and what he tolerates in his environment naturally reflects what he already requires of himself. Standards that flow from a desire to control or impress others are brittle. They depend on external validation to feel real, which means they're vulnerable to exactly the social pressures they're supposed to resist. The practical implication is this: the work of having standards begins entirely with yourself. Before anything else, before deciding what behavior you won't accept from others, before determining which relationships deserve your investment, before establishing what your time is and isn't available for. The question is simpler and more personal. Does how I'm living actually reflect what I claim to value? Are my habits consistent with my stated priorities? Do the people who watch me daily see a man whose actions and words inhabit the same reality? Most men, honestly examined, have some distance to close here. Not because they're dishonest, but because the gap between stated values and lived behavior is one of the most common features of human psychology. We believe in things we don't quite practice. We hold ideals we don't quite embody. We know what we should prioritize and fill our actual time with something different. This gap, when it exists and goes unaddressed, produces a particular kind of internal noise, a low-grade dissonance that a man might not be able to name precisely, but that registers as a persistent sense of something slightly misaligned, like a picture that's almost straight, but not quite. Closing that gap, through the patient, unspectacular work of actually living by the things you claim to value, is the foundation of standards as identity. Because once a man's daily behavior is genuinely consistent with his stated values, he stops being someone who has standards and starts being someone who is his standards. The distinction sounds subtle. The effect is not. Think about what it actually communicates when a man's behavior is visibly consistent over time. When he's the same person in private as he is in public. When he treats the person who can do nothing for him with the same consideration he gives to the person who can do everything for him. When he holds to a commitment even after the circumstances that made it convenient have changed. When he declines something that would benefit him, if accepting it would require compromising something he said he values. Each of these moments is, individually, a small thing. Together, they constitute a kind of evidence. Evidence about who this man actually is, not who he presents himself as, not who he describes himself as, but who he demonstrably is through repeated, observable behavior. And evidence of this kind accumulates into something that no amount of self-promotion could produce. A reputation for integrity that people feel before they can justify it. A sense that this particular man can be trusted to be who he appears to be, even when appearances are inconvenient. What a man tolerates becomes who he is. This principle works in both directions, and it's worth sitting with the uncomfortable version. Every time a man accepts treatment that falls below what he claims to value, every time he lets a boundary be crossed without consequence, every time he stays in an environment that consistently disrespects his priorities, every time he makes an exception to a standard he's publicly held, he teaches something. Not just to the people around him, to himself. He teaches himself that the standard was conditional, that it applies in theory but yields under sufficient pressure. And once a man's own standards have taught him that lesson often enough, the standards lose their structural function. They're no longer the filter through which he evaluates what belongs in his life. They're just aspirations, things he'd like to be true about himself, occasionally acted upon, more often accommodated around. The man whose standards have become identity has avoided this erosion. Not perfectly, not in every instance, not without moments of compromise that he'd redo differently given the chance, but consistently enough, and honestly enough about the moments he fell short, that the overall pattern is legible. He is recognizably, reliably, the same man in the situations that matter as he is in the ones that don't. That consistency is the thing. Not performance, not reputation management, not the careful curation of how he appears. Just the simple, radical act of being the same person when it's costly as when it's easy. Every time a man lowers the bar to keep the peace, he teaches the room what he's worth. Every time he holds it calmly, without drama, simply as a statement of fact, he teaches the room the same thing. The question is which lesson he wants them to learn. Chapter 11. Becoming the man the world cannot easily shake. Respect doesn't come when you demand it. It comes when you stop needing it. And that transition takes most men by complete surprise, because it doesn't arrive the way they expected. There's no moment where someone formally acknowledges the shift, no ceremony marking the change, no clear before and after that a man can point to and say, that's when things became different. It happens the way most real transformations happen. Gradually, then suddenly. A series of small, unspectacular moments accumulating into a new reality. And one day, a man looks at how the world is responding to him and realizes, with some combination of relief and disorientation, that something fundamental has changed. He stopped chasing something. And the thing he was chasing showed up. This chapter is about what that accumulation actually looks like. Not as inspiration, but as architecture. The specific internal structure that, once built, makes a man genuinely difficult to destabilize. Not difficult in the aggressive sense, not fortress-like or defended or closed off from the world. Difficult in the way that a well-rooted tree is difficult. Flexible on the surface, immovable at the foundation. Capable of moving with pressure without being moved by it. The components of that structure have all been examined individually throughout this book. But they don't operate individually, they compound. A man who has stopped chasing approval finds it easier to stay calm under pressure, because his emotional state is no longer dependent on how the pressure resolves. A man who stays calm under pressure finds it easier to say no without explanation, because the discomfort of the other person's reaction doesn't immediately destabilize him. A man who says no cleanly finds it easier to protect his availability, because he's already demonstrated to himself that his priorities can hold against external demand. A man who protects his availability develops quieter confidence, because his time is visibly not automatic, which means his presence carries weight. A man with quiet confidence pauses more naturally before reacting, because he's not running the constant calculation of how to protect his image. A man who pauses develops clearer direction, because the noise of constant reactivity isn't consuming the bandwidth needed to think about what he's actually building. A man with clear direction keeps his word more reliably, because his commitments are made against the filter of his path, rather than the pressure of the moment. A man who keeps his word stops needing to win arguments, because his credibility is established through behavior rather than defended through debate. And a man who doesn't need to win arguments holds his standards more naturally, because he's not sacrificing them to manage impressions or avoid conflict. Each trait reinforces every other. The system becomes self-sustaining. This is what internal stability actually feels like from the inside. Not a dramatic sense of invincibility, not the absence of difficulty or doubt or days when everything feels harder than it should. Just a gradually increasing sense that external circumstances have lost some of their former power over internal states. That the opinion of a room no longer determines the quality of a day. That a setback is a setback rather than an indictment. That criticism is information rather than verdict. That pressure is a condition to be navigated rather than a force that gets to decide how you feel about yourself. The world does not become easier, but the man becomes more capable of meeting it as it actually is rather than as he fears it might be. There's a specific quality that appears in men who reach this level of internal stability that I want to name carefully, because it's frequently misunderstood. It can look from the outside like indifference. The man who doesn't react immediately, who doesn't need the room's approval, who holds his standards without drama and declines without apology. He can appear, to people accustomed to more reactive behavior, as though he doesn't particularly care, as though he's detached, as though the stakes that animate everyone else simply don't register for him. This is almost exactly backwards. The stability doesn't come from caring less. It comes from caring about the right things more. The man who appears unaffected by social pressure is often deeply invested in his work, in the people he's chosen to be close to, in the principles he's decided to live by. What he's not invested in is the performance of those investments for an audience that didn't ask to be convinced. He cares enormously about what he's building. He simply stopped requiring the world's moment-to-moment validation that the building is worthwhile. That distinction between genuine engagement and performed engagement, between real investment and the anxious need to be seen as invested, is one of the most important a man can make about his own psychology. Because men who perform their values are exhausted by the performance, and men who live their values are sustained by them. The external world responds to internal stability in ways that are consistent enough to be worth describing plainly. Conversations become different. People bring harder problems, more honest questions, more genuine versions of themselves. The social interactions that once felt like negotiations, everyone managing impressions, everyone slightly on guard, start to feel more like actual exchanges. People trust a stable man with real things, with uncertainty, with decisions that actually matter, with the parts of their situation they haven't figured out yet and aren't performing confidence about. Because they sense correctly that he won't be destabilized by those things, won't panic, won't judge, won't make the situation about himself. Professional environments respond similarly. The stable man doesn't become the loudest voice in the room. He often remains one of the quieter ones. But his contributions carry a different weight. Not because he's earned a title or accumulated credentials, but because the consistent pattern of his behavior has established something that titles and credentials never quite can. A track record of being the same man in difficult moments as in easy ones, of being reliable when reliability was inconvenient, of being honest when honesty had a social cost. That track record is, ultimately, what authority is actually made of. Not position, not performance, not the aggressive assertion of status that some men mistake for leadership. Just the quiet, accumulated evidence of a man who can be counted on to be who he appears to be. The transformation isn't dramatic. It rarely announces itself. It's a series of small moments where you simply didn't react the way you used to, didn't collapse under a criticism that would have previously undone you, didn't chase an approval that would have previously seemed necessary, didn't lower a standard to ease a tension that would have previously felt unbearable. Each of these moments is, by itself, unremarkable. Together, they constitute a man. Not a perfect man, Not a man without difficulty or doubt or the occasional collapse into old patterns, but a man who has built something internally that the world has to work considerably harder to shake. A man who carries his foundation with him rather than searching for it in the reactions of everyone around him. And here is the final paradox, the one this entire book has been circling. The man who reaches this place, who has genuinely stopped needing the world's approval, stopped chasing validation, stopped requiring external confirmation of his own worth, becomes, almost without trying, someone the world wants to approve of, wants to validate, wants to follow. Not because he performed it, because he earned it, by becoming, quietly and consistently, and without announcement, the man the world cannot easily shake. Chapter 12. The loneliness nobody talks about. At some point in this process, you will notice that certain people are no longer as comfortable around you as they used to be. Not enemies, not people who disliked you to begin with. People who were friendly, who were present, who occupied real space in your daily life. They'll still be polite. They'll still exchange the normal social currency. But something will have shifted in the texture of the relationship. A subtle withdrawal, a slight increase in distance, a quality of interaction that feels, if you're honest about it, like they're not quite sure what to do with you anymore. This is one of the least discussed costs of becoming a more grounded man. And because it goes undiscussed, most men aren't prepared for it. They expect that improvement will be universally welcomed, that the people around them will recognize the change, respond positively to it, perhaps even be inspired by it. What they don't expect is that some of those people will quietly exit, or stay physically present while becoming emotionally elsewhere. The reason is straightforward, even if it's uncomfortable to name directly. Some relationships were built on the version of you that no longer exists. Not maliciously. The people involved didn't consciously sign up to be in relationship with someone's unresolved need for approval, or someone's reflexive availability, or someone's willingness to make themselves smaller to keep the peace. But those qualities shaped the dynamic. They created a particular kind of comfort. The comfort of a man who was predictable, accommodating, easy to influence, unlikely to create friction. And some people, without realizing it, organize their relationship with you around the reliable presence of those qualities. When the qualities change, the relationship has to change too. And not everyone wants to make that adjustment. There's a specific kind of person who is drawn to men in the pre-transformation state. Not predatory, necessarily. Just oriented toward a particular dynamic. Someone who needs to be the more decisive one in the relationship. Someone who has learned to rely on your automatic yes. Someone whose own sense of confidence is partially built on the contrast with your accommodation. These relationships can feel like closeness. They can involve genuine warmth, real history, actual care. But underneath the warmth is an architecture that depends on a specific power arrangement, one where you are more pliable and they are more directive. When you stop being pliable, the architecture becomes uncomfortable for them, and discomfort, for people who aren't accustomed to examining it, often translates into distance. I lost a friendship I'd had for nearly a decade during a period of significant personal change. Not in a dramatic way. There was no confrontation, no specific incident I could point to as the breaking point. It simply became apparent, over the course of several months, that the version of me he'd been friends with was no longer the version showing up. I had fewer automatic agreements. I held positions that I would previously have softened. I declined things that I would previously have rearranged my schedule for. He didn't say any of this, but the invitations became less frequent. The conversations became shorter, and eventually the friendship quietly reduced itself to the occasional check-in that both of us knew, without acknowledging it, had replaced something that used to be more. For a long time I questioned whether the changes had been worth it, whether something was wrong with the direction I was moving, whether a man who was becoming more grounded should also be becoming more isolated. The questioning itself was useful. It forced an honest examination of what had actually happened. And what had happened, examined honestly, was not that I had become less capable of friendship. It was that a specific friendship had been built on a foundation that my growth had removed. The warmth had been real. The history had been real. But the architecture underneath had been dependent on a version of me that no longer existed. That's not a failure of the process. It's evidence that the process is working. This is the thing that doesn't get said clearly enough. Some relationships in a man's life are not actually relationships with him. They're relationships with his availability, with his compliance, with his need for approval, with the particular configuration of insecurities that made him easy to be around in a specific way. And those relationships, as warm as they can genuinely feel, cannot survive contact with a man who has moved past those things. Not because he's become cold or difficult or less capable of connection. Because the thing the relationship was actually connecting to is no longer there. The loneliness this produces is real and worth acknowledging without minimizing it. It doesn't feel like progress in the moment. It feels like loss. The calendar is quieter. Certain familiar presences are absent. The social environment that once felt full begins to feel, at least temporarily, like it has gaps in it. But what fills those gaps, over time, is different in kind from what was there before. Because a man who has become more genuinely himself, who has stopped performing, stopped accommodating, stopped organizing his presence around what others need him to be, becomes capable of a quality of connection that the approval-seeking version of him never quite accessed. Real connection. The kind built not on the comfort of his compliance, but on the reality of his actual character. The kind where the other person knows who they're dealing with, knows his actual opinions, his genuine limits, the things he cares about and the things he doesn't, and chooses to be there anyway. Those relationships are rarer. They are also considerably more sustaining. The friendships that survive a man's transformation, or more accurately, that begin after it, tend to have a different texture from the ones built on the earlier version. There's less management involved, less calibration of what to say and what to conceal, less of the low-grade performance that characterizes relationships built on approval. More of the particular ease that comes from two people who are both genuinely present rather than both managing impressions. That ease is worth the loneliness that precedes it. Not because the loneliness is small, it isn't always small, but because it is temporary. And what it makes room for is not. The people who belong in a grounded man's life will find him. Not in a mystical sense. They won't materialize from nowhere. But the version of him that exists after the transformation is findable in a way the earlier version wasn't. Earlier, his actual self was obscured by layers of accommodation and performance. Now it's visible. And the people who respond to what's actually there, rather than to the performance of availability and agreeableness, are responding to something real. Which means what gets built with them is real too. The loneliness nobody talks about is not a sign that something went wrong. It's the clearing that happens before something genuine can grow. Chapter 13. What you build in the dark. Nobody is watching, which is exactly why this is the chapter that matters most. Everything discussed before this point has a social dimension. How you appear under pressure, how you set boundaries in conversations, how you carry yourself in rooms full of people reading your signals. Those things matter. But they are, ultimately, outputs, visible results of an invisible process. And the invisible process, what a man does when there is no audience, no feedback, no one to impress or disappoint, is the actual determinant of everything else. The dark is not metaphorical, it's specific. It's the hour before anyone else is awake. It's the commitment kept when canceling would have been entirely consequence-free. It's the standard held in a situation where lowering it would never have been discovered. It's the work done on a day when motivation has completely disappeared and no one is monitoring whether the work gets done or not. What a man builds in those moments is not a reputation. Reputations are what other people construct from the evidence they can observe. What gets built in the dark is something prior to reputation and more fundamental than it. Character. The actual internal structure of who a man is when being watched is not a variable in the equation. Most men have a gap between their public and private selves that they've learned to manage rather than close. The public self is disciplined, principled, reliable, or at least presents itself as such in the moments when presentation matters. The private self is somewhat more negotiable. Standards slide when no one's checking. Commitments get quietly renegotiated when the only party to the renegotiation is the man himself. Habits maintained visibly become optional invisibly. This gap has a cost that most men feel but struggle to locate. It produces a specific kind of internal noise, a low-grade awareness that the person being presented to the world is not entirely identical to the person running the operation behind the scenes. Not dishonesty exactly. Most men in this situation aren't consciously deceiving anyone. But a misalignment, a sense that the confidence being projected is slightly ahead of the foundation actually supporting it. That the identity being inhabited publicly is aspirational rather than earned. That noise is exhausting in ways that are difficult to attribute correctly. A man in this state often feels tired without obvious cause, vaguely defensive about scrutiny even when scrutiny isn't present, slightly uncomfortable with extended honesty about himself, because extended honesty risks surfacing the gap. He invests significant energy in maintaining the presentation, which means significant energy is unavailable for actually becoming the thing being presented. The alternative is not perfection, it's alignment. Alignment means the private man and the public man are engaged in the same project. Not because the private man is performing for an imaginary audience, but because he has internalized the standards deeply enough that they operate independently of observation. He does the work on the days nobody checks because the work matters to him, not because someone might find out if he doesn't. He holds the commitment when breaking it would be costless externally, because breaking it would not be costless internally. He maintains the standard in the dark because the standard is genuinely his, not a performance he's sustaining, but a reality he's living. This internalization doesn't happen through willpower. Willpower is a finite resource and a poor foundation for anything that needs to last. It happens through repetition, through the accumulated experience of showing up privately, consistently, over enough time that the behavior stops requiring effort and starts requiring only continuation. The early stages are difficult. The discipline that precedes internalization is real work, genuinely effortful, sustained against genuine resistance. But past a certain threshold, the work becomes simply what the man does. Not because he's forcing himself, because it's who he is. There's a specific form of confidence that only this process produces. Not the performed confidence of a man who has learned to project certainty. Not the social confidence of a man who has become comfortable in rooms. The quieter confidence of a man who knows, from private evidence that no one else has access to, that he can be counted on. That when the situation requires him to be who he claims to be, he will be that person. Not because circumstances are favorable, but because he has been that person in the dark. repeatedly, for long enough that it is no longer conditional on circumstances. This knowledge changes a man in ways that are visible without being explicable. People sense it as groundedness, as a particular quality of ease that doesn't seem dependent on external conditions, as the specific kind of calm that comes not from confidence in outcomes, but from confidence in one's own response to whatever outcome arrives. They can't point to exactly what creates it, but they feel its presence and its absence accurately. A senior colleague of mine, someone I respected enormously and observed carefully for several years, had this quality in a way I found almost disorienting when I first encountered it. Nothing seemed to particularly rattle him. Not in a detached way, not in a way that suggested he didn't care about outcomes. He clearly cared. He was deeply invested in his work, present in his relationships, engaged with the texture of what was happening around him. But there was a settledness underneath all of it that I couldn't account for from what I could see of his life. It took years before I understood it well enough to name it. What he had built, over decades of private discipline and private standard holding, was an internal track record so extensive that external uncertainty had lost most of its power over him. He knew who he would be when things got hard. He had evidence, private evidence, accumulated in the dark over years, of showing up as himself when showing up as himself was costly. That evidence had become the foundation, and foundations of that density don't shake easily. The dark is also where a man's relationship with himself is most honestly revealed. In the presence of the other people, there's always some degree of management happening. Impression management, relationship management, the ongoing calibration of behavior to social context. This is normal and largely unavoidable. But in private, the management falls away. A man is left with who he actually is when performance isn't required. For many men, that encounter is uncomfortable. The private self is less disciplined, less principled, less admirable than the public one. The standards are lower, the commitments are looser, the habits are worse, and the discomfort of that encounter, of knowing who you actually are when no one's checking, can become a form of low-grade shame that a man carries without quite naming it. The shame of the gap between what he projects and what he actually practices, closing that gap through the patient, unglamorous, entirely private work of becoming in the dark what you present in the light, is perhaps the most important project a man can undertake. Not because it will be recognized, not because anyone will applaud the closing of a gap they couldn't see in the first place, but because the man himself will know. And what a man knows about himself, privately and honestly, determines his floor, the level below which he will not go regardless of external pressure, because going there would require becoming someone he has private evidence of not being. That floor is everything. It's the thing that holds when circumstances stop cooperating, when the approval disappears, when the validation dries up, when the external structures that once reinforced behavior are no longer present. The man whose floor was built in public, maintained through external accountability, dependent on observation, real only when someone was checking, discovers in those moments that his floor was actually a performance. And performances, removed from their audience, have nothing to stand on. The man whose floor was built in the dark discovers something different, that it holds, that the foundation is real because it was built in conditions where reality was the only audience, that who he is doesn't change when the circumstances change, because who he is was never constructed from circumstances in the first place. This is the final piece, the thing underneath all the other things, the invisible infrastructure on which everything visible rests. What you build in the dark is what you actually are. And what you actually are is the only thing, in the end, that the world cannot take from you. None of this was about becoming someone else. It was about unlearning the patterns that were quietly making you easier to overlook. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Because most men who begin this kind of work expect the destination to feel like arrival, like they've finally become something they weren't before. A new version, an upgraded model, someone fundamentally different from the person who started. But that's not what actually happens. What happens is closer to subtraction than addition. The approval-seeking falls away. The reflexive over-explanation falls away. The need to win every room, fill every silence, defend every position, accommodate every request, all of it gradually loosens its hold. And what's left underneath all of that is not a new man. It's the actual man. The one who was always there, running quietly underneath the performance. That man doesn't need to prove himself. He already knows what he's worth. He doesn't need the room's validation, because his sense of himself doesn't live in the room. He carries it with him, in his principles, in his direction, in the quiet consistency between what he says and what he does, and increasingly, in what he does when nobody is watching. That last part matters more than most men realize until they've done the private work long enough to feel the difference. The public presence, the calm under pressure, the clean boundaries, the quiet confidence. These are real. But they are shadows cast by something deeper, by the man who exists in the dark, by the standards held when holding them cost something, and nobody would have known the difference, by the commitments kept not for reputation, but for the simple integrity of being a man whose private and public selves are engaged in the same project. When those two things align, when the man in the dark and the man in the room are recognizably the same person, something settles. The internal noise quiets. The performance falls away not because it's been abandoned, but because it's no longer necessary. There is nothing to perform. There is only what's true. This is not a destination that gets reached once and held permanently without effort. There will be days when old patterns reassert themselves, when the approval machine reactivates, when pressure arrives and the pause disappears and the reaction comes out before the choice did, when a boundary gets softened that should have held, when the private discipline slips and the gap between presentation and reality quietly reopens. These moments are not failures. They're information. They show a man exactly where the foundation still needs work, not as cause for self-criticism, but as honest data about what to return to. And there will be other costs. The loneliness that arrives when relationships built on the old version of you quietly dissolve. The disorientation of discovering that some people preferred you when you were easier to manage. The particular kind of solitude that precedes the deeper connections. The ones built on what's actually there, rather than on the performance of availability and agreeableness. That solitude is not failure either, it's the clearing. The space that opens when what was there by habit finally gives way to what belongs there by choice. Throughout these chapters, the patterns examined were never about tactics or performance or social strategy. They were about something quieter and more durable. The slow construction of a man whose internal life is stable enough that the external world loses its former power to constantly redirect him. A man who has, through accumulated small decisions made mostly in private, relocated the source of his worth from outside to inside. The world will keep arriving with its tests. Criticism will appear. Pressure will apply. People will push against boundaries to see if they hold. Situations will arise that seem specifically designed to activate old anxieties and old reactions. None of that stops. The world does not become gentler for men who develop psychological strength. If anything, it occasionally becomes more direct, because people sense correctly that this man can handle honesty in ways that more fragile men cannot. What changes is not the world. What changes is what the world can do to you. And here is what the full arc of this work eventually clarifies. The men who command genuine respect, the ones who make rooms quieter simply by being present, who attract trust without soliciting it, who hold their standards without drama and their direction without apology. These men are not extraordinary. They have not achieved something superhuman or accessed some rare psychological gift unavailable to everyone else. They have simply, over time, stopped doing the things that quietly undermine a man's presence, stopped chasing approval, stopped reacting before thinking, stopped explaining themselves to people who didn't ask for an explanation, stopped making themselves endlessly available to everything and everyone at the expense of what actually matters, stopped building in public what needs to be built in private, and started, in the space created by those absences, building something real, something internal, something that belongs to them entirely, not because they declared it, but because they earned it, in the dark, alone, when no one was watching and it would have been entirely easy not to. You already know what that looks like. You've seen it in other men and recognized it immediately, even when you couldn't name exactly what you were seeing. The steadiness, the quiet ease, the sense that this person's foundation doesn't shift depending on what the room decides about them today. That's not a personality type. It's not a gift. It's not something some men have and others permanently lack. It's a practice, built in private, visible in public, sustained not through performance but through the ongoing, unglamorous, entirely personal decision to be the same man in the dark as in the light. And it begins, as almost everything real begins, not with a dramatic transformation or a moment of sudden clarity, but with something considerably smaller and considerably more honest. A single moment where you held the standard when you could have let it slide, where you did the work when no one was checking, where you chose, in the quiet, to be who you're still becoming. One moment, then another after that, until the man you were building in the dark is simply the man you are.